Gift a friend of Booktown subscription at Christmas for those hard to buy for. Why not make a gift of membership to a loved one to be a friend of Booktown for 1 year, with the donations going directly towards putting books into the hands of our tamariki through our Children's Book Voucher project. Visit our website www.booktown.org/Friends of Booktown for more info.
First of all, I just want to welcome our panel. We have Kiri Allan. Welcome, Kiri. And we love people who, and I particularly like people who just say yes to things in life, and we never thought we'd get you, Kiri, and here you are. And we're delighted that you're here. We have from the Bay, Rick Barker. Thank you very much. Marilyn Waring, who's going to be on tonight as one of our stellar writers and speakers. So there are going to be 10 special writers featuring tonight, and Marilyn's one of them, and Marilyn's been at Booktown Festival before, and we're delighted to have you back, Marilyn. And a great friend of Booktown, Mayor of Carterton, and also former MP, an all-round agitator and nice man, and the best way is Ron... I've just been talking before to Tim Clark, who, with Tessa, sponsored the Pluck of the Irish. So I was just going to call you Ron Clark, but I thought that's not right. So we're off to a great start. Now, fixing the bear pit. I was on the programming committee, and we were very excited about this session because I think the derivation of the bear pit comes from the New South Wales Parliament. About 100 or so years ago. It was so awful and so aggressive and so toxic and also, I think, so male. So that's where the bear pit name comes from. And I think more recently it's been used in New Zealand. But if you want to know where it comes from, I lived in Melbourne for 8 years. So politics in Australia is a contact sport. There's no doubt about that, and still has always been and still is today. And then of course, we had the Francis Review, I think, in 2019, which was pretty damning. And I did some preparation on my walk back here from the Royal Hotel, and this is what a former person who worked at Parliament said to the Francis Review. I just couldn't cope with it. It shocked me. It's taken me years to recover. I still can't bear it that my last job in the workplace ended so badly. So that seems to be and then just recently, I think there was a survey of women in Parliament which was very negative about that place. So let's explore why it is that it is the way it is, and then maybe we can have a conversation about how it could be better. But first of all, I'd like to ask each panellist, what was your first experience like when you got to Parliament as a first-time MP? And Kiri, can we start with you?
Damn it, I was looking at you, Ron. O tuatahi me mihi ka tika kia koe, Biggie. Mō tō tino mahi e preparation ana mō tēnei kōrero. Nā kahuru aku whakaaro ki te mana whenua o tēnei rohe rangitāne ki Wairarapa, ki Papawai marae hoki. Nō reira, kia koutou kua hara mai, kua tai mai I tēnei ahi hei mō tēnei kaupapa. Karea I te tino mōhio he whakahirahira hioi, maybe he katakata noiho. I was just saying, I said, welcome to this event. I'm not sure, thanks for coming. I'm not sure if it's going to be an amazing special event or one that makes you crack up and laugh, or if we go to the depths of who knows where. But thank you for having us. My name's Kiri Allan. I became a Member of Parliament in 2017 for the Labour Party as a list MP. My first experience, I showed up really early on the first day at Parliament and I was scared, really, really scared. My first distinct memory though was like running up, I was going to my first caucus and I was hiding behind Reno Tirikātini, who's a massive giant, and we were coming up the back steps into the caucus room, and obviously there's a fair bit of excitement because we're all new MPs, and I'm hiding behind him timidly. And I remember opening the door and there was the media gallery. It was the first time I'd ever experienced it, and I just with all of their cameras, and I just jumped back, slammed the door, and that was my introduction to Parliament. You probably wanted a deeper answer.
And what did you expect? Why did you go in there, and what did you expect?
You know, I went in there probably with this burning sense of wanting to make change, like I think most people do, on both sides of the house. I think that I'd say 95% of the people that enter into the Parliament have some real sense of wanting to make change, and we may have different ways of going about that or thinking that we should go about it. I think probably prior to going in, I was a public lawyer prior to going in. I think that you could understand some of the scope by which you can make change within that institution, and there are many powerful levers by which you can pull, but there are many, many limitations. And particularly when you're in different parties, you know, we were in government. There are some, and the way in which, well, 2017 compared to 2020 was slightly different. But you can go in and have lofty aspirations about what it is that you might want to achieve within their institution. But there is so many compromises that you must make along the way in order to get things over the line. I think that that was one of the biggest challenges that I found personally. That was both as a backbencher and as a minister. And you've got to know where your personal boundaries are in terms of how many dead rats you want to swallow, because you can make a measurable change within that environment, but sometimes the decisions that you the consequences of some of the decisions are really tough to live with. And I think that's probably will go towards a little bit the culture discussion that we have about how Parliament and the beehive works.
And thank you, Kiri. And talking about compromises, Marilyn, look, from a distance, I mean, you went in as almost a lone woman in the 75, in the Muldoon years, and it seemed to me, again, not as a political person, but looking on, that you compromised, perhaps, I don't know, until you felt enough in 1984. Would you like to tell us about your experience, and particularly what led to your decision not to compromise anymore in 84, which actually brought down a government?
Well, I was a research officer in Parliament buildings. 1975, International Women's Year. I went to a women's electoral lobby meeting in Wellington, and we had the fabulous women leaders in that. There was Sonia Davies, Margaret Shields, Fran Wild, Judith Aitken. It was an extraordinary group of activist women, and they'd all written to, well, Social Credit was included, Labour National executive directors of parties saying, why aren't there more women candidates? And it was if the boys had got together for morning coffee and psychostyled a reply, and they all said, oh, we'd love to have more women if only they'd offer themselves, you know. So I was 22, and a group of us after the meeting went off and said, oh, well, you know, there's nothing else. We'll just stick our names in, and then at least they won't have that excuse anymore. So I stuck my name in. But at that point, it was the last safe seat for National to choose a candidate. They'd been without a woman in caucus from 72 to 75. And I think it would be a bit exceptional to pretend that the 130 farmers in the room thought that they were doing the National Party a good turn by sending a woman. And truly, after the fourth ballot, when they announced, after 2 ballots, I thought I could really relax now, because that's me over and done with. It's been quite fun. And then finally they announced that I'd won, and every instinct in my body was to walk up to the microphone and say, look, I think there's been a dreadful mistake. But there were literally people standing on their chairs, cheering at what they'd just done. So the building, I knew the opposition wing really well, because that's where they'd been. I was incredibly lucky to have been the research officer for George Gear, and he became my political dad, and he was one of the most inoffensive, creative, imaginative, honest MPs I ever encountered. So I had a great mentor and a great guide. I remember on the first day that I was there, Keith Holyoake was still in caucus. That gives you. All of the women MPs, and on the anniversary of 100 years of the suffrage, were given a porcelain white camellia, and mine is number 15. So I'm effectively the fire of the female MPs, because numbers 1 to 14 are all deceased. I remember being taken out to the front steps to conduct this television interview with Sir Keith, and they asked him if he had any advice for me, and he said, yes, I've told her to breathe through her nose. I didn't. I didn't. Bigsy, I crossed the floor more than 100 times, so I wasn't compromising. I crossed the floor on every single division of the change in the Employment Relations Act, and we've got residue of that right now. On Springbok tours, on environmental legislation with Minogue Shearer, but until the bitter end in 84, however many times Mike and I went across, we could never destable, there was always a majority. And even on the very last vote, which I will talk about this evening, social credit, Beetham and Knapp went with Labour, Michael and I went with Labour, and the two Labour MPs who had lost selection for the next election were held in the National Government Whip's office and plied with alcohol, and they voted with the government on that particular juncture. It was, on one hand, the most extraordinary education I ever had. People shared extraordinary things and told you unbelievable stories, and that was the education. And it was the loneliest place I've ever been.
Well, let's get into that, Marilyn, and a bit later on. But also, thank you for enlightening me particularly. I was studying to be a priest up in the mission in Hawke's Bay, so I wasn't following politics that closely. I was picking grapes and studying philosophy and theology, and I also taught Latin there. So I was not aware that you'd crossed the floor numerous times during that national government time, so thank you. I just remember the 1984 particularly, but we'll come back to that. Now, Ron, you were a minister, and in fact, Helene Quilter, who's a great friend of mine, who was Secretary of Defence, described Ron as the best minister she'd ever worked for. And so, Ron, you've had a life that demanded some resilience, and also you were in the army. So you've seen some pretty tough cultures. So how did Parliament compare to that when you went in there?
I think it's fair to say, Bigsy, that I was totally unprepared for what I walked into. I was, I had a mother-in-law at the time who was Labour, and of course I stood for, my first tilt at Parliament was forced upon me by her, who left me with no option. She actually nominated me for Parliament in 1990, and I was accepted as a Labour candidate, but I only just got back from the Middle East and didn't really think it was appropriate, and besides, I didn't really agree with a lot of what Roger Douglas and Richard Prebble had done, so I bowed out of that. In 1993, I couldn't avoid it. But things happened, so Helen, I became a very good friend, close friend of Mike and Yvonne, over that time. And then, of course, when Helen Clark tipped him out of the leadership, we fought against Ruth. I almost took her out. I was 540 votes short on the night. People thought I'd win the seat, which would have put the Labour Party back in government, but I missed on that. And then, of course, things happened and I left the Labour Party. And eventually Winston came to see me and asked me if I'd stand for New Zealand First. So when we did the deal...
Which year, which election was that?
96, I went into Parliament. And of course, when I went into Parliament, it was the very first MMP government and election. And we were in coalition negotiations with National Labour. And I think what I totally underestimated was the venom that we wore immediately for choosing to go with National. People had gained the impression that we would go with Labour. So, you know, I had National Party people who campaigned against me who weren't happy with the fact that I tipped out their Minister of Finance, who eventually resigned from Parliament and caused another by-election. And then Labour was just venomous with me for having gone to New Zealand First and then put National in government and coalition. So that first few weeks was pretty nasty, and I was not prepared for that. But of course, you know, I guess there's something in me that enjoys that sort of a challenge, and so that was it. And then, of course, to make things worse, Winston decided to make me the chief whip, and I became the junior whip for the government. I had no idea what a whip was. I thought it was one of those kinky nights you had out in Auckland somewhere, but I had to. Rick's been a whip as well, and so I found the most unlikely good friends in Bill Birch and Don McKinnon, people who, when I was campaigning for Labour, we saw as the Prince of Darkness, Bill Birch. But I found him just a lovely, lovely guy, and they became quiet mentors to me and teaching me what whipping was all about. And I learnt the dark side of whipping. You don't talk about that too much, but it's essential for keeping control of the caucus so that you can get legislation across the line. And then, of course, we had Tuku Gate and all the rest of that stuff and the coalition blow up. And that's so between 1996 and 1999 was my baptism of fire, and you couldn't have done it any better than that in terms of wanting to know just how venomous the place can become. But, you know, you put your name up, and if you want to make a difference in the country and you truly believe in the policies that you're supporting, accepting that there are times when your party and your caucus are going down a pathway that you don't want to go down, and you have to make those compromises, and you swallow hard and you do the job, because you know some further down the line it's going to be someone else's turn in the caucus, and that's what a team is. You either work as a team and you go ahead, or you don't and you break apart and you fail. And so, yeah, pretty hard few weeks after that coalition announcement, and being attacked by people who had been personal friends in the Labour Party in the way in which I was. That was an eye-opener and character building.
Was it any different for you in terms of being a minister?
Yeah,
and I'll come back to talk to Kiri about that too soon.
Yeah, as Kiri knows, it's a different world. And you can be in Parliament a long time, and I actually would always say to people, it's worse when you go into Parliament as an MP and straight into government. It's worse, because you stick to the line, the executive is making decisions, you can lobby and fight as hard as you like in caucus, but when the executive makes its decision, that's the decision. And you go out and sell the policy. And you're not in the executive, so you can't do. When you become part of the executive, it's quite a revelation. You think, oh my God, so this is where the power is. This is where it's all done. This is where the trading happens. And in a coalition environment, it's even more interesting, because then you are having to make even more compromises than you might have normally felt comfortable making. And that's challenging. It is challenging, and it's challenging for you to have to put down some of your own personal beliefs and do what's best for the greater good of the whole team, and to keep the government there, because once the government's thrown out, well, they can't do a thing. And so being a cabinet minister, yes, there are people like to talk about baubles and privileges. Do you find any? Oh. No, not really.
I didn't like the cars.
Yeah, well, you know, I found I couldn't use it.
Kiri's just said she didn't like the cars.
Yeah. Yeah, so, but I think you do, that's when you really learn how you could make it. you got the chance to make a difference by advancing your policy. What I became a little wary of, so I saw it unfold in front of me, was ministers who took a lot of pride in having so many portfolios. I had 2. I was offered 4. I took 2, and I stuck with 2, because you can't read everything. And when you don't read everything, Kiri, people slip stuff in. And then you're responsible, then you're accountable. Or if you don't read it and the stuff in there that's just simply wrong, you're responsible and you're accountable. So it's a big responsibility and it's a big task, but it's most satisfying when you win.
And thank you to Ron, who's you've got a voice problem today, and you're struggling a bit, but thank you very much. We'll keep going until you conk out, if that's all right, Ron. That's the rules. Now, Rick, you're a trade union movement before Parliament, and again, that's a pretty robust context. How did you find coming into Parliament?
Well, I'm used to quite a robust environment. I was brought up by a Scot who was a coal miner. Language is blunt and direct, and you asked him what he thought of you, he told you, unvarnished. So it was a very direct environment I lived in. And one of my favourite stories from the union movement is from Ken Douglas, who said that at a fiery meeting of the drivers' union in Wellington, one of the people who were upset at what the leadership was doing made some comments about the secretary. And the union president said, whoa, rule such and such, unseemly language. I find you $2. This is in the 70s. And suddenly in the middle of the room, this great big truck driver stood up, strode forward, pulled out his wallet, banged $20 on things. I'll have $20 worth, thanks. You see, life has its challenges, and if you put yourself up for the leadership, you've got to expect not only bouquets, you've got to expect bricks. The second thing about Parliament is it doesn't, shy, country, brown church mice don't get there. It's full of people who have pushed and jostled to get there, gone through all sorts of hoops to get there, and you come in contact with some quite robust personalities. And for a number of people, this is a bit of a shock. So I think it's a question of how you respond to it is about your own way in which you set yourself up. One of the things I did, just what I thought when I went there, I come from a very humble background. My grandmother thought all of the power rested on Cameron Road in Greymouth. She was just so disconnected with all these things. And my grandfather had been a coal miner, with a long line of coal miners. They never had any contact with this level. So when I walked into Parliament as an MP, I'd been there many times before that, and stood there and walked across the green carpet, I was in awe of the place. And I thought, if my grandmother was still alive and I went home, she wouldn't know what to say to me because I'd been to a completely foreign land. This was unknown to her. So I had enormous respect for the place. I did. But I did 2 things before I went. I sat down, I wrote down a list of things which were important to me. And one of them was I must always be able to look myself in the mirror in the morning. So I was never going to do something I could not live with in the future. List of things I did that. Second thing I did is I went all around the caucus with existing MPs and asked them for one tip they'd give to me as a new MP. I got 2 really good ones. One was from David Longy. Make sure you write your own letters. Don't get other people to write your letters, because if you're walking down the street and Mary comes up to you and says, what do you think of my letter? If you haven't written it, you won't remember it. I thought, wow. So I wrote all my own letters. The second really good tip was from Anne Collins, who said, make sure you keep close to your friends. She said, you're moving away from home a lot, 3 days a week, 4 days a week, get busy with all these other things. Sure, you've got to keep close to your family, but it's your friends who will hold you secure. Too many people here don't see their friends, keep connected to them, and they get lost. And so I always made sure I had regular time for my friends. So I worked out a pattern of how I was going to look after myself, manage the sort of stress of the place, because it was going to be stressful, and frankly, I enjoyed every day of my 18 years in Parliament. I thought that going into that Parliament was interesting. There was always something going to happen, completely unpredictable, and a large part of it was pure theatre. I just thought there, well, I'll just watch how these people play the game. And I just went there to enjoy it. Serious work? No doubt about it. No doubt about it. but you had to look for the theatrics and just admire it on occasion. Some of it was stunning.
Look, I know Chris Featherston very well, and you worked with him when he was Treaty Negotiations Minister, I think. So you seem very comfortable after your parliamentary career working across the aisle. Was that the way you worked within Parliament?
Absolutely. One of the things I had as a union official, my first union boss said to me, whatever you do, Rick, you must always be able to walk back in to that place again to help the next person. So you can't actually have a dispute which leaves the person feeling bruised personally. So I had a policy of always focusing on the ball, not the player. It was always the issue, not the person. And so I always worked with people. I never had a crossword, particularly with anybody in Parliament. I don't remember anybody saying anything offensive to me. I've made some really good friends across the House. I was engaged with them as people, and I would count quite a number of the National Party as amongst my personal friends. If I was ever in trouble, I could ring them up and they'd come and help me, because it was a personal thing and the politics was separate. I looked upon politics as being different as a person's religion is. So you might be a Buddhist, well, I don't make judgments about that. You might be a Muslim, I don't make judgment about that. But if you had some political views which went beyond the extreme, well, then I would have. But by and large, I tried to keep the politics out of it and see you as the person, what you bring to this, and your personal integrity and what you were doing yourself. You know, do you help your friends? Do you look after people about you? I'd watch how you went about getting your meal. If you spoke to the staff behind the counter and you knew them, I'd say, you're a good person. John Banks, I got on with really well, to a lot of the chagrin of my colleagues, because I saw John Banks ask the guy carving the meat, oh, how are you, Fred? How are you two boys getting on at cricket? Are they still enjoying that? And I thought, wow, you got me.
So is that unusual? I mean, in terms of what your own kind of North Star and your own way of operating, were you on your own in terms of bringing that approach to Parliament?
No, I think a lot of others were like me. I don't see that. As I said, I found by and large Parliament to be quite a convivial place. I've been to other organisations like on local body politics, and local body politics is tough in comparison. I tell you what, they play the game like amateurs. Politics in Parliament is played by professionals. It's a different league. They can be nasty. Go to a school PTA meeting, and you'll see some of the worst politics. They even made a song about it, Harper Valley PTA. I mean, when it crashed, everybody recognised that. I mean, let's face it, some places can be. They've elected the Pope, and there's been some great rows there. They locked him up for 1,000 days one time to get an answer. They had one job, elect the Pope, still couldn't do it. I mean, so it's some of those things about humans. It depends on who you are and what you are, and any group can behave badly.
Can you? I'll come to you, Ron, in a minute. But Kiri, would you like to expand on Rick's experience in terms of your own experience?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there's a reason why we all have very different experiences of being in Parliament. When I went to Parliament, I didn't find it a comfortable place. I wasn't in awe of the buildings. I didn't feel like I belonged in that environment. And I think that the places that we come from, the communities that we carry, the expectations that are on our various shoulders, there are different weights that come with that. And so I came from a community I come from a family, there's 10 of us. My parents had been, it was a tough, we had family life was a little tough. And I think, and then when you're going into an environment like that, you're the first person that's ever within your community ever come near the baubles of power. The hierarchy of the institution, I laughed about the cars. I hated it. I hated the hierarchy. I hated the way that people were put on pedestals. Right from day dot as a parliamentarian, you were put into this elevated position. That's not what some of us go there for. You go there because you want to work in behind your communities and yell as loud as you can for those people that have never had a voice within those institutions. I remember taking this big group of kohanga kids. My daughter was about, 3 or so, and they're all from Te Teko. Don't know if you know where Te Teko is, but it's one of the centres of the universe, about 20 minutes outside of Whakatane. Now, these kids would never, I don't know how many times that those kids are ever going to enter into that building. But what I decided to do when they came in, with all of their families and things like that, is I wanted to make it feel like they were powerful within that institution, because I felt scared. Every single day I went to work, I felt intimidated by the environment. So we let them run, we let them sing songs, I took them into the select committee room where their ancestors had fought for generations, for land rights, for human rights, to be seen. And those kids, they squealed and they ran, and people looked at me like it was silly, but for me that was a reclamation of power. A reclamation of power that had been taken away from communities, and communities, again, that didn't feel like they had a voice or a place or a space within the decision-making environments at the utmost levels within this country. So my experience from Rick's was very different, and I think that you go in, I went in, like Rick, we had very clear checklists. These are your boundaries, this is what you will do and this is what you won't do. And yes, you always had to, I think that was one of the biggest things that you get told when you go into that house, is you want to always be able to look yourself in the mirror. But I remember the one time as a minister, I took up a paper one time when I was the Minister of Justice. 7 times I fought against my own paper that I was taking into Cabinet, because it was an area that was very contentious at the time, and I won't get into the policy particularly. But 7 times, and 6 times of that 7 won the table. On the 7th I didn't, and on that day I had to go out and sell that policy to the country. That was the worst day of my life, not the car crash, didn't even come close. But it was the fact that I actually couldn't go home that day and look myself in the mirror. And so I had breached one of my codes in order for the collective good, what I thought was, the government and their aspirations. So I feel like each of us has very different experiences based on what we set out to achieve, I think, a little bit, and the pressures that we feel from different places and peoples. You can work so hard to get your core policies and principles, let's go, over the line, but at the end of the day, when you're a parliamentarian in a majority party, in a government party, I think it's a lot more challenging than it looks on the TV screen. I think that, like Rick said, the parliament itself, that's theatre. I always described it as rugby. You got 2 teams, you got to ball each other around, and you smash each other out there on the pitch, etc., and then you all go home. But the real work is not in the parliament and asking questions. The real work is in the background rooms where you're fighting not necessarily the opposition, but you are fighting so hard within your caucus to get agreement, to get things over the line. That to me was the most challenging part, especially when you stood maybe not to the centre of the core beliefs of what it was that you were trying to add to the centre of the majority of your caucus. So it was hard. She was a hard yakka, and doing that all day, every day for 6 years. Yeah, it wasn't. I don't know. 1, I'd never do it again. 2, I wouldn't wish it upon my friends or my family. 3, I'd only support people that really felt like that was the environment that they wanted to work and operate in order to make change.
And Ron, thank you, Kitty. And Ron, you wanted to say something?
I'll just pick up on where Rick was. I think we hear a lot of talk about the bear pit, and we hear a lot of talk about how acidic the place is, and we need to understand it's a place where the contest of ideas, opinion, ideology, policy takes place, and it has to be robust. You have to be able to defend your corner, and if you feel passionately about a particular policy or law change or legislation, you argue it to the best of your ability. And I think that the key is, and people don't see it because it never gets portrayed by the media or shown by the media, is the things that Rick is talking about. I always say, and it's interesting you should bring up the rugby thing, Kiri, because If you saw the parliamentary netball team and the parliamentary rugby team together on a Saturday, you would be flabbergasted. Because there you have Nanaia Mahuta, Parikura Horomia, Jerry Brownlee, me and Karen McAnulty and a whole bunch of other people, the cricket team as well, cross-party, all together, out there raising money, whether it's for the Riversdale Surf Lifesaving Club as it was, or a mum in Masterton who needed Keytruda for her cancer treatment. And you all come together as parliamentarians. You're all colleagues. Yes, you're from different parties. Yes, you have different ideologies. You may have just been scrapping over a private member's bill the Wednesday before that Saturday, but on that Saturday, you're a bunch of colleagues out there having fun doing something good for the community. And you leave all that other stuff behind, and you focus on what it is you're trying to do for the community. You play the game. And it's the same in Parliament. You have the debate, you play the game, and once you walk out of that chamber, you would be surprised the number of people who go up and smack their opposition colleague on the shoulder and say, that was a good one, but you need to take on board this, or and then you'll go and have a beer. Well, not so much nowadays, because 3.2 doesn't operate the way it did back then. And in Robert's day, I think they had 3 bars in Parliament. They don't anymore. The snooker room doesn't get used in the ways that it probably did in the 1960s and 70s. It doesn't get used at all. But it's a different place to that which you often see on your television screen. It truly is. And to be able to have a general debate in your 5 minutes, get down, get hard, get mean, either attacking some other policy from the opposition or from the government, and defending your own, that's what you're there for. But so long as Rick says, so long as you don't start playing the man or the woman and you stick to the policy or the ideology that you're debating, you're in pretty good space. But I think also the other comment about you can judge MPs by the way they treat airline staff, taxi drivers, stewards, parliamentary staff, parliamentary security. And generally, if you see it there, it probably is true of that person. And that's where I tended to find the ones that I was going to have difficulty with. And being a kid who, 6 foster homes between 3 and 16, I know what it's like to be down there. And I always remember one of my foster fathers saying, always remember, Ron, when you're climbing that ladder up, take a good look at the faces of the people you go past, because they're the ones you're going to see when you fall. So look after them. And I think so the majority of the MPs, I don't care which party they come from, the majority, they tend to understand that. There's the odd one, but we know them.
So you mentioned, Ron, what we see on TV, and Marilyn, Richard Harmon's not here, so I can ask this question. What responsibility do the media have in either creating or portraying Parliament as an aggressive, negative, adversarial place? Full responsibility. Sorry, Rick? Rick's just said full responsibility. Yep. Yeah.
In 1975, as the candidate for Raglan, I went to visit Bruce Martin, who was the editor of the Waikato Times, and he showed me around, introduced me to all the staff, said to me, okay, we'll get on really well if you recognise this. I'm not here to educate the people. I'm here to sell something that's worth 10 minutes, and tomorrow it's fish and chip paper. And as long as you remember that, we'll be fine. And I don't think anything's changed, even with social media, etc. While I'm listening to you people talking, I'm thinking to myself, it's hilarious, I was on a different planet. Yeah. Well, first of all, you're all trapped by your party, all of you. Because the one thing I wanted, if you really want to ask how to change the bear pit, it's get rid of MMP and get rid of the absolute suffocating power that political, I fought against MMP because I could see it was going to give the parties more power, that there would be no room for independent thought anywhere, no independent could ever win a seat, and we would be suffocated by the kind of bullshit that's going down in this coalition government. I haven't finished. And you weren't in there with Muldoon. And leadership sets a tone. And if the tone is the kind of unspeakable behaviour that was had by that person in charge, and it doesn't matter, you see, you can have the bully boy or you can have the completely ineffectual Teflon, which we've got at the moment. And whatever it is, or you can have the bastard sitting over there in New Zealand First calling on people's nationalities to call them out in the house, who of course was schooled by Muldoon, never forget that. I don't find, you might, you know, you're talking about it like it was a jolly picnic. No, it's not, and what's more, it shouldn't be. Because if people were allowed to speak with their conscience, I didn't bloody compromise because I did not have to suck the rat of the government policy. And two pieces of advice. First of all, Doug Carter, who I replaced, saying to me in my first campaign, you will have to live with what you do for decades longer than anybody else in this place. Never do anything that means you can't lie straight in bed at night. And I carried that was like a torch, and that was incredibly important to me. And the other thing was from George Gear once saying to me, came out of another battle in caucus, and George said to me, I'm sorry, dear, I'm so sorry this keeps happening. I was always dear, but it didn't matter with George. I never minded with George. I minded from a lot of other people it was patronising, but he meant dear. He said, you're just so far ahead of us. And I said, George, you're all behind. I'm with the people. And that's where Parliament is still behind. Still behind. Look at the nightmare of pay equity that we've just come through. It's outrageous.
So, Rick.
I want to say that I have a lot of sympathy for the position that Marilyn's put forward. I first went into Parliament when it was first past the post, and I had seen the whole era of dissident voices out there. And when I was first there, the dissident voices were tolerated. But over the period of time, I've seen that the parliamentary system has become more and more corporatised. The Leader's Office wasn't very big, and I've seen the Leader's Office in every parliament get bigger and bigger. When I first went there, each MP had resources and had access to research, access to this, and the Whip's Office had control of it. And I've seen how the control the Whip's Office had of these resources be shifted to the Leader's Office. The access that individual MPs had to press statements became shifted to the Leader's Office. And I had a talk to a member of Parliament one time about a particular issue there, and they wouldn't put out a press statement which was right on their area for their people in their concern, because they didn't think they would have the approval of the Leader's Office. I said, tell the Leader's Office to get stuffed, but they wouldn't, and I was shocked. And I mean, I agree with Marilyn. I'm not sure that I agree with her prescription for Curia, but I do feel we have lost that independence of MPs. When I first went there, the Labour caucus was a collection of fiefdoms, and had different people had different ideas. You had Jeff Braybrook on his thing, and you had Richard Prebble on his thing, and others on there, and they all had their different, and you could hear all these multitude of voices. Well, you only hear one voice now, and I think we've lost with that. I agree with Meryl on that 100%.
Look, this is great. We've got 10 minutes to go. It might be a bit longer, Shelley, because we started a bit late. But can we just very quickly, so Marilyn, MMP, ditch it?
Yeah, yes, STV, because it gives you, first of all, it ensures that you get good regional representation. Secondly, it gives the space for independents to get through. Listen, frankly, if they can manage it in Australia, we can manage it here. No, definitely that. I just want to say, so that's one thing I would definitely do. Absolutely. And the other thing, I was just joking with Kiri about it, but truly, look, loads of you in the hall will understand this. If you really want to stop bear pit behaviour, when women walk into a room that invites that sort of behaviour, you change the furniture. And if you change the way that they sit, and they can't look at each other, and they can't just yell at each other and abuse each other, if they just sit like you're all just sitting now, and the person who wants to speak has to come up here and talk. I've seen this operate in Scandinavian parliaments. You never sit in the same desk twice. You take the desk near the front if you're going to be a speaker. You take the desk near the back if you're just there to listen or whatever. You're all too busy to yell and at each other. Look, God help us, it's even better in the US Congress and Senate, the seating arrangements, you know. And the fact is that although loads of them are, you know, they're only there because the right millionaires got them in there, the thing is that they don't just sit in there and yell abuse at each other because they're too busy and, you know, and because the seating's different. So that's why I'd change the furniture and I'd change the voting system.
Kiri, thank you, Marilyn. Kiri, how would you fix the bear pit, building on what Marilyn has suggested?
Well, I love Marilyn. I love her ideas, so I agree with them and endorse them wholly. I think that the other thing too is that so much of parliamentary behaviour is dictated by party politic, and it's the scrap to win as opposed to an ideological advancement or engagement. And I think that New Zealand collectively loses so much from the behaviour that Parliament puts against each other. If you had a real contest of ideas as opposed to just the scrap to be the one that holds the Treasury benches, we'd be so much richer for it, because on some issues, you know, we're actually not too far apart, but you have political parties vying to take the other one out, which, you know, that's not aspirational. At a local level, when I think about if we're coming into general election, we have, you know, let's say the three parties on the left will go in and scrap each other and take each other out to win the power for over a seat. It just isn't conducive to good decision making. And I kind of giggle with what's going on right now with, do I giggle or am I enamoured? I'm enamoured by what's happening right now in the Parliament with what the Māori Party have just done with the Haka and the Privileges Committee. Now, what they are doing is delegitimising the power that that institution has had. They are saying that, no, we don't accept that we will not be dictated to by this place or these rules. And we're seeing that there is an immeasurable amount of support for what they're doing. Now, they're about to be penalised in a significant way, most likely. But I think that we're at this interesting time, and perhaps it's post-COVID where there's been this real intense scrutiny, but these institutions of power, whether they are the Parliament or the executive or whether they're the courts, but they're under incredible scrutiny right now by the general populace as to whether or not these institutions are operating in a way that makes sense for the way that our nation should be developing and governed and ruled. And I think where a lot of that, the delegitimising of these institutions is coming from is because a lot of people are saying that this culture that we have in the way that we govern our country, you'd invite school children to come and watch from the top of the Parliament, and they would walk away absolutely bemused by the way that parliamentarians would act and operate within that house. It doesn't make sense. So that's the squabbling, it's the scrapping, it's the yelling at each other across the house, it's the whipping of votes when you're probably not that ideologically opposed, but you want to grab power. Our kids are watching this going, we wouldn't be able to do this within our playgrounds or our classes or anything, but here we are as the decision makers of our country operating in a way that is absolutely contrary to good behaviour and what our expectations would be of each other. So I think that there needs to be a fundamental shift. I love the way that Marilyn articulates it, change the furniture and change the culture.
Because if you look at the Edelman Trust Monitor, I mean, the trust in politicians, in our institutions, in our media, it's dropping like a stone. So it's a big problem. Rick, very quickly, because we want to have some audience questions, what would you do to fix the bear pit?
Well, I agree with Marilyn. I'd like to look for another system. I'm not quite convinced that STV is the right answer, because it needs to have multi-members in a particular area, and when you get to the bottom of the South Island, the areas are so big and a disconnect. But we must be able to figure out a better system. But on the other side of it, I'd also say there are some things which will just simply divide people. And if I was in Parliament now, and if they came with the change to the law on equal opportunities and for the fair living wage, I don't think there's any way in hell I'd sit there silent like a stuffed mute while they went on like that. I don't care where you put me in the seat, how you arrange the furniture, some things would just boil my blood. And I would not be a silent witness to it no matter what. So I don't know how you smooth that out. The thing is, though, with the Europeans, they have a general consensus in a lot of those countries about how they'll operate. They tolerate unions, they expect fair wage to be paid, they do these things, they expect high taxes to provide social services. This is just the way they are. We haven't got that kind of philosophical agreement in New Zealand. And it is a New Zealand which in my lifetime has had a massive transfer of wealth to the few, and I've seen communities all across be impoverished, and nothing has been done about it. So there is an ideological divide here. It's deep and it's bitter, and it's turning ordinary people off. And on your last point, I'd say to you, one of the biggest criticisms I have of the 84 to 90 Labor government is that they breached the trust with the public. Forget all the rest about Rogernomics. I argued about all of that. But there was a breach of trust. They never said what they were going to do before they did it. Second point is that when National came in, Jim Bolger said, watch my lips, no ifs, no buts, no maybes, and the superannuation surcharge was going to go. But it didn't. And MMP was brought upon this, not because of some writers say about how Democrats got this and voted, it was because the public said, a pox on both your houses. Now, if this system isn't going to work, I think there would be sufficient courage in this community for people to make a change, and I think they would do. But we have to find something which is credible, that people would say, well, we'll support that, and if we get that, the public will vote for it.
Thank you, Rick. And come to you, Ron, in just a moment. And just a plug for 10:30 a.m. tomorrow, we've got the Rogernomics session, and Rick and Marilyn are going to be in that, so we'll pick up some of the points there. Ron, close us out before I go to the audience.
I'll try and keep it short, but look, I absolutely agree with Marilyn around STV. It's been one of my bugbears and all the time. What people don't seem to realise is that you don't actually have MMP. You have an MMP election, and then because you have the Westminster system, which I assume you've all condoned for all the years you've been voting, it becomes the FPP Parliament. You have to have this current structure is a reflection of the Westminster system. It is not MMP. You first have to form a government, and to do that under the Westminster system, you have to have a majority. So you hoover up coalition partners, then you set your new government in place, and then you operate as an FPP government. First past the post, on the vote, legislation by a piece of legislation, day in, day out. If you truly wanted to have a parliament that was more representative, more inclusive, that disempowered the two major parties, you would have voted for STV. But people found that difficult to understand and comprehend, and Rod Donald ran and a good friend of mine, Tony Day, my Labour regional chair when I was there, and he was my campaign manager. They ran a solid campaign for MMP, and that won the day. But ask people, why do certain councils have STV? Ask, why does Fonterra use STV? Why does the Greater Wellington Regional Council use STV? Because it gives a better selection of representatives, and you rank and preference the people you want, and that's how you get a more diverse parliament. That's how you get different behaviour, because now you've got to work to get each and every vote across the line, and that's where your moderation comes in. But hey, you didn't vote for it, you lost. And there has to be a time when we go back to the polls and ask the people of New Zealand, are you happy with the current form, or would you like something else? And I'm hopeful that the people of New Zealand will go STV.
Thank you, Ron. Now we've got time for a couple of questions, and we've got some roving mics here. Sorry, I put you wrong. The Rogernomics session tomorrow is at 9:30. And I also want to acknowledge Christine and David Kernahan, who have generously sponsored this session. Thank you very much to Christine, and David passed away just recently. And we remember David with great fondness. We have a question here.
I wonder if one of the panel would like to consider, in this current state where we have an environmental catastrophe impending, we have a potential huge pandemic again, and we have unacceptable poverty, homelessness. Can we afford to have an adversarial party system? Is there a better way, even beyond the voting, but should we move towards having a more collaborative kind of parliament?
Who would like to pick that up? Rick? Or Marilyn? Yep.
How do you collaborate with people who want to get rid of pay equity? How do you collaborate with people who want
Fair comment.
the fair living wage? These are people who are poor, and you want to rip it out from underneath them. How do you cooperate with that? I can't see how you cooperate with that. I'd like to find a way, but I can't.
Marilyn, would you like to build on that?
Yeah, and also, even when they do collaborate, can you believe them? So, two stories. First, I'm sitting in the National Party caucus, and the Think Big stuff has just begun, and there's going to be a discharge from the Motunui Synfuels plant into Tiatiawa there. And the legislation that Maturata had promoted for the Treaty of Waitangi was only current, for current issues. There was no capacity to look at historic claims. And so Muldoon's really stuck because this is a current issue and he is going to have to go with the claim. And he sits there in caucus and said, the only reason that we all voted for it, the whole Parliament voted for it in 1975, was because we thought it would never work. So there's one collaboration. Here's the next collaboration. The next collaboration is 2022, when you have women like Erica Stanford and Finance Minister Willis saying, I'm so proud of this pay equity legislation for my daughter and my potential granddaughters and everything else. And 2 years later, all collaborated, everybody collaborated. Business New Zealand was in there, all the unions was in there. The two major parties totally voted for it, not ACT, but everybody else. And so 2 years later, with no evidence at all, because it will save billions, all of a sudden, it's not collaboration.
Thank you, Marilyn. Thank you, Rick. One more question, if we've got one. Down the back there. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Glenn Barclay aho. You mentioned the Francis report at the beginning of all of this. On behalf of the PSA, I was on the reference group for that exercise. We haven't heard much about the behaviour within Parliament as it affects staff. We heard some terrible stories through that process. There are a whole bunch of recommendations that were made. I believe most of them were implemented, but I'm not sure that actually anything has fundamentally changed. Be interested in comments on that.
Any questions on that in terms of the
all
impact
I'm going
on staff?
to say is, again, as I've listened, you might imagine that as the trusted fire of women MPs, ever since 1984, I've been the dear auntie on the phone. It doesn't matter which side you come from, you can call me safely, because it doesn't matter how extraordinary and dire it is, I believe you. And there are still women members of Parliament who call me and who come to stay with me to recover. So it is still dreadful in there.
Well, it obviously, from our panel's conversation in Korero this afternoon, a lot needs fixing. And I'd like to thank our panel. I'd like to thank Ron Mark. I'd like to thank Marilyn Waring, Rick Barker and Kiri Allan. Please give them a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen.